So, I want to talk tonight about Endgame, the book on the reality, and the way, that book really began from a fundamental question of, do you believe that this culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And, I've asked that question of thousands of people, and nobody ever says yes. One guy at one of my talks raised his hand, and everybody looks at him. He said, "Oh, voluntary? No, of course not." And so the next question is, if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, and you care about the land where you live, what does that mean for your strategy and for your tactics? And the answer is we don't really know. And one of the reasons that we don't know is because we don't really talk about it. And one of the reasons that we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that we have hope. And I'm going to do some serious hope bashing later. It's one of my favorite things to do. So that's really where I want to, and that's really what the book is about, is if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation, what do you do? And so I think what I would like to do is go through the premises of that book. And one of the reasons, one of the things I've done in Endgame is I put my premises in boldface in the front of the book. And one of the reasons I did that is because one of the first rules of propaganda is if you can slide your premises by people, you've got them. About Hitler, it was said, from insane premise to monstrous conclusion, Hitler was coldly ideological. So he would say, what are we going to do about the Jewish problem? Gosh, Adolf, good question. What are we going to do about it? But see, what he's done is he's slid the premise by you that there's a Jewish problem you have to do something about. Or similarly, you hear some talking head on television say, so how can we make the U.S. economy grow? God, good question. Well, okay, some of the premises. A, we want the U.S. economy to grow. B, we want the U.S. economy to exist. C, who the hell's we? And so, like I said, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to slide premises by people. And so the structure of this talk is going to be that I want to go through some of the premises for that book. And the first premise is that industrial civilization is not, and civilization itself, but especially industrial civilization, is not and can never be sustainable. Civilization is not and can never be sustainable. A few years ago, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine who, we were stuck in traffic, and I was just making conversation, and I said, so George, if you could live at any level of technology that you wanted, what would it be? And George can sometimes kind of be a curmudgeon, and that day was not in a good mood, and he said, Derek, that's a really stupid question. We can fantasize whatever we want, but the truth is there's only one level of technology that's sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we're going to be there again someday, and the only question really is what's going to be left of the world when we get there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that any way of living that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. In fact, it takes anybody but a rocket scientist to figure that out. That before we go any further, it's like, okay, that's nice. What's civilization? And, I've been bashing civilization for about 15 years now, and so I figure I'd probably better finally define it. And the definition that I'm using is that civilization is a way of life that's characterized by the growth of cities. And that's defensible both linguistically and historically. Well, that's nice, Derek, but what's a city? And a city, I've defined as a collection of people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. And what that means is the Tolowa, on whose land I now live, were not civilized. They didn't require the importation of resources. They didn't live in cities. They lived in villages, camps, and once again, they didn't require the importation of resources. They would eat salmon and clams and huckleberry and salal and salmon and salmon and salmon and salmon, and then usually through the winter they would eat a lot of salmon. And the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And this culture has been there for 180 years, 170 years, and the area's getting pretty trashed. And so two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One of them is that your way of living can never be sustainable, because if you require the importation of resources, it means that you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource, and as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area. And denuding the landscape of a resource harms the land base. It's very interesting. You know, I know we've all been told that natural selection is based on competition, and that, you know, it's all just a fierce battle for who can be the meanest and grab the most resources most quickly and exploit the most thoroughly. But short of showing how stupid our discourse is, I can disprove that in one sentence if you give me a couple of semicolons. And that's those creatures who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run. Semicolon. You don't survive in the long run by hyper-exploiting your surroundings. Semicolon. You survive in the long run by actually making your habitat better. What a concept. Okay, so anyway, two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One is that you can never be sustainable, which means we could all become the best little natural capitalists in the world, and it doesn't matter. So long as there is this fundamental system in place, it's not going to be sustainable. And the other thing it means is that your way of life must be based on violence, because if you require the importation of resources, trade will never be sufficiently reliable. Because if you require the importation of resources, and the people in the next watershed over aren't going to trade you for it, you're going to take it. Which means we could all become junior bodhisattvas, and it wouldn't matter. The US military would still have to be huge, because how else are they going to get access to our oil that just happens to be under somebody else's land? If they require that oil, they're going to take it. So those two things are really fundamental. Because I've been talking about resources, so I want to go back to what I was saying before about any way of life. Another way to look at all this is any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources also won't last. I mean, it doesn't matter what resource you're talking about. I mean, you would think that if you have a way of life that's based on the use of, I don't know, let's just choose a random example, oil. You would think that you would start to consider what's going to happen when this non-renewable resource runs out. That, once again, just by definition, any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. And I would go a step further, and I would say that any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources won't last. So if every year there are fewer salmon returned than the year before, eventually you're going to run out. And everybody knows this except for Michael Sissenwine, who is in charge of one of the divisions of the National Marine Fisheries Services, and his response when learning that 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone was to say, that's not a problem. We have to ask what level of decline is reasonable or sustainable. Exactly. And so in basically 2 sentences or 3 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, 2 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, reasonable, and sustainable. So in any case, if every year there are fewer passenger pigeons returned than there were the year before, eventually there will be none. If every year there's fewer old-growth forest, which once wasn't called old-growth forest but was simply called home, then eventually it will be gone. And I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to say that any way of life that's based on the use of resources won't last. Because a resource is something there to be used. And there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman, when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when I look at trees, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. I'm going to convert them into dollar bills. If when I look at trees, I see trees, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular tree, I see this particular tree, I'm going to treat it differently still. And it's the same with fish. If when I look at salmon, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at salmon, I see salmon, I'm going to treat them another way. If when I look at this particular fish, I see this particular fish, I'll treat it differently still. The same is true also of women. If when I look at women, I see orifices, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at women, I see women, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'm going to treat her differently still. If you perceive another as a resource, you're going to use them as opposed to enter into a relationship with them. And I need to be really clear that just because I perceive a fish as a fish, that doesn't mean that I can't eat it. And I was doing a radio interview in Spokane, Washington several years ago, and the interviewer said, you know, Indians exploited salmon too. And I said, no, they didn't, they ate them. And he said, what's the difference? I said, well, they gave them respect for the spirit in exchange for the flesh. And I knew that that answer was kind of bullshit, but I'm a male, and so I'm required by law to answer every question that's asked of me. And so that afternoon I went out and I sat next to this tree that I had a long relationship with, and I asked the tree, what is the fundamental predator-prey relationship? And the tree gave me the answer right away, which is if you consume the flesh of another, you now take responsibility for the continuation of the other's community. So if I consume the flesh of salmon from the Klamath River, I now take responsibility for the continuation of the Klamath River salmon. And that's, everybody knows this. You know, bears know it, mergansers know it, newts know it. The mergansers know that if you consume all the newts in this pond, there won't be any newts in the pond anymore. And we just forget sometimes. And that's the fundamental predator-prey bargain that we have to get into. And I want to say something else about that, and then we'll come back to the other. But I got into a big argument with this guy several years ago because he was saying that because I use toilet paper that I am just as culpable for deforestation as the CEO of Weyerhaeuser. And I knew that that was wrong, but I couldn't really articulate why. And he said, go ask a tree. A tree will tell you. So I went out and asked a tree, and the tree said, you're an animal. You consume things. Get over it. But then it also gave me the other answer, which is yes, I am culpable, not because I consume the flesh of a tree. I'm culpable because I consume the flesh of a tree without fulfilling my end of the bargain. I'm culpable not because I use toilet paper, but because I don't stop Weyerhaeuser from deforesting. And that's a much more serious culpability than simply consuming. So I'm not culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon. I'm culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon and I don't take out the fucking Iron Gate. Thanks. Okay, second premise is that traditional communities do not often voluntarily give up or sell the resources on which their communities are based until their communities have been destroyed. They also do not willingly allow their land bases to be damaged so that other resources, gold, oil, and so on, can be extracted. It follows that those who want the resources will do what they can to destroy traditional communities, as we see. Third premise. Our way of living, industrial civilization, is based on, requires, and will collapse very quickly without persistent and widespread violence. I gave a talk a few years ago in Eugene, and afterwards this guy raised his hand and he said, you know, you talk about how violent this culture is, and I just don't see it. There's no violence in my life. I'm not violent myself. I don't see any violence. And it's significant to this story, by the way, that it was a man who said it, not a woman. And I said, okay, where's your shirt made? And he looked and it was made in Bangladesh. And I said, do we even need to talk about that? He's like, no. I said, okay. And also, I'm just wondering, do you pay rent? He's like, yeah. I said, why? He said, because I don't own? I said, no, what would happen if you didn't pay rent? He said, well, I get evicted. I said, what does that mean? I don't understand. What happens when you get evicted? And he said, well, a sheriff would come to my house, and he would... I said, stop right there. What happens if the sheriff comes to your house, and you say, hey, I was just getting done cooking dinner. Come on in. Have some food. So the sheriff comes in, sits down, and you cook him dinner, and you feed him, and you don't poison him. And then after dinner, you say to him, you know, it's been nice having you here, but your company's not all that pleasant, so I would like for you to leave my home now. What would happen? He said, well, the sheriff would take out his gun, and he'd say, I'm here to evict you. You got to leave, because you didn't pay your rent. I said, so the reason you pay rent is because if you don't, some guy is going to come to your house with a gun, and he's going to kick you out of your home. He's like, I guess. I said, okay, let's try it again. What happens if you're really hungry, and so you go to the grocery store, lots of food there, you know, and you start eating. What's going to happen? So we're going to call the sheriff, and he's going to come. He's the same guy. He's a real asshole, isn't he? The sheriff's going to come and take you away. So what this means is that in order for you to survive, in order for you to have a place to sleep, a place to be, you have to pay somebody. And in order to eat, you have to pay somebody. That's really weird. And if you don't, somebody with a gun is going to come and do something bad to you. So part of the reason that a lot of us don't see the violence is because, well, part of the reason is a different subject. Part of the reason is because a lot of the violence is exported. I was doing a talk in Massachusetts a few years ago, and somebody said to me afterwards, you know, we now are living way more sustainably than they did 100 years ago. And I said, how do you know that? He said, because there's a lot more trees here in Massachusetts than there were 100 years ago. I said, yeah, it's because you're getting all your wood from South America. And so a lot of the violence is simply exported. And then the other part of it is a lot of us don't perceive this violence because we've been so metabolized into the system and we so accept its premises that there's no need to do violence to us because we're standing straight in line. But of course, if we step out the tiniest bit, gotta watch out. Oh, but we're not going to do that. Okay, now we go to the fourth premise. This culture, civilization, this I think might be my favorite premise of the book, is based on a clearly defined and widely accepted, yet often unarticulated hierarchy. Violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is nearly always transparent, invisible, it's unnoticed. When it is noticed, it's fully rationalized. Violence done by those lower on the hierarchy to those higher is met with, is unthinkable. And when it does happen, it's met with shock, horror, and the fetishization of the victims. And there's so many examples of this. One example is that within my own family, when I was a kid, my father was extremely violent. And, you know, so the violence flowed constantly downhill. And the one time that my brother ever fought back, he got beaten far worse than any other time because, of course, he had committed blasphemy by sending violence up the hierarchy. That's one example. Another example is, oh, I live where there's tons of bears near where I live, and I just love seeing them. Oh, it's so cool. A mother and baby bear actually fell asleep outside my mom's house the other day. And so I was thinking about that afterwards. How many wild animals have I ever seen asleep? And, well, 2 bears. Maybe some grasshoppers, it's hard to tell. Anyway, so I mean, but people, and I walk through the forest all the time. I walk through forest at night with no lantern and all this stuff. And the Fed's going, huh, he walks through the forest at night with no lantern. You can use that. Anyway, so I walk through the forest. I'm scared of the Feds, frankly, not the bears. Anyway, so I walk through the forest at night, and people go, oh my God, aren't you scared of the bears? I mean, they could attack or something. And I know that there is one person dies in North America every other year from bear attacks. And 46,000 Americans die every year because of automobile crashes. So we're scared of the wrong thing. I mean, we should walk through a parking lot and it's like, oh my God, you know, the cars are all going. Anyway, if you don't believe me about the violence is only allowed to flow one direction with that, the next time there's one of those, like the next time there's a big protest or something, maybe anti-war or anti-so-called free trade, you know, whatever, just do an experiment, which is take a baseball bat and then just walk up to one of the policemen and say, excuse me, Officer Friendly, nothing personal, I'm just conducting an experiment. And hit him, and then hit him a couple more times real fast. And then, somebody's going to take down your name. Okay, so anyway, and then I'll talk to you in about 50 years. Because you've committed blasphemy, you've sent violence up the hierarchy. Oh, and then I want to say one more thing about this, which is that and this is going to have to, does anybody mind if I swear? I think that the word fuck is the most amazing word in the English language because it's all of patriarchy condensed into 4 letters. Because the same word that means make love to means do great violence to. That's really, really twisted. And it's also kind of confusing. I mean, because so somebody can say to me, like, I'm going to fuck you. And I'm like, I need more information. I mean, even within the context of a loving heterosexual relationship, this shows how deeply the objectification of women, how deep the objectification of women goes within this culture and within our language, is even within the context of a loving heterosexual relationship, it's really hard to not have the woman get objectified. So the man says to the woman, I would like to be inside of you. You know what just happened? She's the object of the sentence. Okay, on the other hand, the woman says to the man, I would like for you to be inside me. You know what? She's still the object of the sentence. So the man says to the woman, I would like for you to be around me. And she's like, I'm sorry, can you speak English? I don't know what you want. Where it's like okay for homosexuals to be in the military as long as you don't talk about it. I guess you can do whatever you want, you just can't talk. Anyway, but which, by the way, I have to say, full disclosure here, I have to say that I actually agree that homosexuals should not be allowed in the military. I feel very strongly, actually, that homosexuals should not be allowed in the military. But that probably doesn't mean as much as it could, because I also think that heterosexuals, asexuals, the transgendered, bisexuals should not be allowed in the military either. Fifth premise. The property of those higher on the hierarchy is more valuable than the lives of those below. It is acceptable for those above to increase the amount of property they control, in everyday language to make money, by destroying or taking the lives of those below. This is called production. If those below damage the property of those above may kill or otherwise destroy the lives of those below. This is called justice. Sixth premise is the one that I sort of alluded to early on. This culture is not redeemable. The culture won't undergo any sort of voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living. If we don't put a halt to it, civilization, this culture, will continue to immiserate the vast majority of humans and to degrade the planet until it, civilization, and probably the planet, collapses. The effects of this degradation will continue to harm humans and non-humans for a very long time. Seventh premise. The longer we wait for civilization to crash, or the longer we wait before we ourselves bring it down, the messier will be the crash, and the worse things will be for those humans and non-humans who live during it and for those who come after. If somebody would have brought down civilization, whatever that means, 200 years ago, if Tecumseh would have won, then people in the East would still be able to eat passenger pigeons. I mean, never minding passenger pigeons' beautiful existence for themselves. If somebody would have brought down civilization 100 years ago, people in this region, through the crash, would still be able to eat salmon. There's going to be people sitting along the banks of the Columbia 50 years from now, and, well, they'll be glowing, for one thing, because of Hanford, and they'll also be starving to death, and they'll be saying, I'm starving to death because you allowed the dams to stand. God damn you. And you know, but the dams are really important. You know, they're necessary for the electricity to make it so Safeco Field you can move the top back and forth. They're necessary to smelt aluminum for beer cans. Anyway, so the longer we wait, I mean, if somebody would have brought down civilization 100 years ago, we wouldn't have to worry much about global warming, and we wouldn't have to worry about the toxification of the total environment with pesticides. We wouldn't have to worry about dioxin in every mother's breast milk. I mean, if 50 and 75 years from now, are people going to be going, you know, if somebody would have brought it down 75 years ago, we'd still have amphibians. If somebody would have brought it down 75 years ago, we would still have, well, if somebody would have brought it down 15 years ago, they'll be saying 15 years from now, we'd still have sturgeon. You know, it's like, how long? You know, at what point? What's the threshold? You know, 100 years from now, it's like we'd still have, you know, name it. We'd still have oceans. Air to breathe. You know, that's not one of my premises, but that's something that if I would have thought of it when I was writing the book would have been one of the premises, which is the primary, if not only measure, by which we'll be judged by those who come after is going to be the health of the land base. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we voted Democrat, Republican, Green, anarchist, didn't vote at all. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we recycled. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we were violent or nonviolent. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we're nice people or not nice people. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we wrote great books or made great films or did great talks or anything else. They're going to care about whether they can breathe the air and drink the water. You know, we can all fantasize whatever we want about some groovy eco-socialist utopia with free love everywhere. It doesn't fucking matter if you can't breathe the air and can't drink the water. And the only measure, I mean, it's embarrassing to say this, but the only measure by which any generation will be judged is the health of the land base that they pass on. That brings us to the 8th premise of the book. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. Thanks. I have just guaranteed I will never hold public office. Another way to put the 8th premise is, any economic or social system that doesn't benefit the natural communities on which it's based is unsustainable, immoral, and really stupid. Sustainability, morality, and intelligence, as well as justice, requires the dismantling of any such economic or social system, or at the very least disallowing it from damaging your land base. Okay, 9th premise. Oh, the 9th premise is pretty interesting. Actually, I'm getting kind of cold. It's pretty interesting. You know, I can bash almost anything I want, and people are cool with it. You know, I can bash capitalism, that's fine. I can bash environmentalism, that's fine. I can bash anarcho-primitivism, that's fine. I can bash myself, that's fine. I can bash blah, 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 it's fine. But there's a few things that you like, cannot bash. For example, if I bash, oh my God, when I bash science, I can just feel the sphincters in the audience start to quiver. Or also, if I bash Buddhism, oh my God, it's like you have not lived until you've been chased down the street by a bunch of pacifists. Or another one that's really hard to talk about is population, and because if you mention that there are more humans on the planet than the planet can support, then people suddenly start to presume that you're actually anti-human, which doesn't really follow in my mind. Oh, it's great too. I got to tell you this. That you know, they say there's no such thing as a stupid question. I got one the other day, and so I'm gonna like tell everybody in the country. There's this. I sometimes do interviews on a radio station south, one county down in Humboldt County, one county south of where I live, and there's this guy who hates me and hates what I say so much that every time I'm on there, he calls up, and I'm not sure. I think he attacks me, but I usually can't figure out what the hell he's saying. And one time I was saying that humans have exceeded carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is the number of any given species who could live in a particular place forever without harming it. So you could have an island that has a carrying capacity of 1,000 deer. 1,000 deer could live there forever. But if you put 10,000 deer there, they're going to eat too much of the vegetation, cause erosion, and lower the carrying capacity, make it so the place can only support 500 deer. Anyway, so I was saying that humans have exceeded carrying capacity. And he called up just sputtering, and he said, "How dare you say that humans have exceeded their capacity to care?" Which may or may not be the case, but that's a different question. Anyway, so the 9th premise is basically, although there will clearly someday be far fewer humans than there are at present, there are many ways this reduction in population could occur. Some of those ways would be characterized by extreme violence and privation. Nuclear Armageddon, for example, would certainly reduce both population and consumption, yet would do so horrifically. The same would be true for a continuation of overshoot followed by crash. Other ways would be characterized by less violence. You know, and I don't know what is going to happen, obviously, but this much I do know, that if we don't approach these problems actively, if we don't talk about our predicament and what we're going to do about it, the violence will be almost undoubtedly be more severe, the privation more extreme. And I want to be really clear. Every cell in my body wants for us to have a voluntary transformation. Just like every cell in my body wants for, that must be the tow truck. Just like every cell in my body wants for people to approach the whole question of there being too many humans, and I'm going to talk more about population in a second. But anyway, every cell in my body wants for us to approach that just reasonably and rationally and intelligently. But of course, we all know what we're going to do is just continue on this freight train to hell until it continues to fly off the cliff. Okay, so anyway, having said that, I need to say, by the way, that I don't think that population is actually, yes, there are more humans than the planet can support, but I don't think the population is a primary problem. I think population is actually a tertiary problem. The reason I think population is secondary instead of primary is that I think consumption is way more important. Because when, I mean, actual numbers don't matter. There could be 100 gazillion people on the planet, and if they didn't eat, shit, or stand anywhere, it wouldn't matter. The important thing is how much damage you're causing or how much help you're doing. Imagine that also, that humans can actually benefit their land base. What a strange concept that is. Anyway, and that's really important because when I think about overpopulation, the first image that comes to mind is, honestly, is a little brown baby with a distended belly in a third world nation. First image that comes to mind. When I think of overconsumption, the first thing I think of is an American. And who causes more damage? So that's why I don't think the population is a primary problem, but a secondary problem. And the reason I don't think the population is a secondary problem, but is actually a tertiary problem, is because, are there any demographers in here? Good, I hate demographers. And the reason I hate demographers is because sometimes they talk about something called the natural rate of population growth, which is that if you have X number of people, then, you know, the population exponentially rises, blah, blah, blah. And it presumes that people breed like rabbits. And the truth is, I don't even think rabbits breed like rabbits. It presumes that people don't make rational family planning decisions based upon their personal and social circumstances. Once again, the Tala lived there for 12,500 years in relatively steady state. And part of the reason is because they had an intimate relationship with their land base, and they would perceive damage to the land base as damage. And if perhaps they start to have too many babies, well, let's cut back. And, I mean, you would think, I mean, let's just think about this. What happens if you have a culture where somebody writes a book, and in this book they tell people to go forth and multiply, and this book becomes a really big bestseller? That's going to affect family planning decisions. And also, I need to say this, too, that there were, in native North America, there were about 250 different plants that were used as contraceptives and abortifactants by the women. And the decisions to use those were made by women. Bunch of fucking primitives. And yeah, imagine that. And oh, I got to tell you the story too. This is so cool. Is back at one point, you know, a bunch of male anthropologists went out, and you know, anthropologists like exclusively male at one point, and a bunch of anthropologists went out, and they were trying to find out what indigenous peoples would use for contraceptive. And they would go talk to the men, because of course the men are the only ones we're talking to. And they say, so how do you not make babies? And they're like, that is a really good question. And so a lot of the anthropologists were saying, indigenous people don't know where babies come from. And then when women started getting into anthropology, the women would go talk to the indigenous peoples, and they would talk to the women, and they would say, you know, how do you not get pregnant? And the women would say, oh, you know, if you take this certain route when you're 16, then you're sterile for 5 years, and when then when you're 20, then you have to do this and this. And the men are like, really? I had no idea. Oh, I want to say one more thing about population, which is that You know, the whole thing about making a wall down in Mexico or down at the border of Mexico, and how we need to stop all those Mexicans from coming up and the Central Americans and the El Guatemalans and the Nicaragüens or whatever their names are. I have to say that I am actually strongly in favor of closing the border to Mexico on one condition, which is that if you close it to people, you close it to the movement of resources as well. Bringing down civilization, when I talk about that, it's not a monolithic act. It's a billion different acts done by a billion different people. And part of my definition, actually my definition of bringing down civilization is depriving the rich of the ability to steal from the poor and depriving the powerful of the ability to destroy the world. Okay, that's nice, Derek, but that doesn't alter the fact that there are people who are dependent upon this social system which is killing the planet. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that just like any good abusive situation, we have been made dependent upon the very system that's exploiting us. And part of the reason that we don't fight back more is because if your experience is that your water comes from a tap and that your food comes from a grocery store, not your head, not your heart, but your experience, if that's your experience, you will fight to the death to defend that system that brings you your food and water, because your life depends on it. And similarly, if your water comes from a river and your food comes from a land base, people used to drink out of rivers, how quaint is that? If your experience is that your water comes from a river and that your food comes from a land base, you will fight to the death to defend that because your life depends on it. But we have all been so made dependent on this system, and it becomes really problematical. It's very nice, Derek, but what are you going to do about this? Anyway, back to the original thing, that taking down civilization is not a monolithic act. It's a billion different acts with a billion different moralities. And so, for example, I don't care what your motivation is, if you blow up a children's hospital, that is an atrocity. I don't care if you're an anarcho-primitivist or if you're a member of the U.S. military. That's just bad. There is no way you can make a moral case for blowing up a children. Oh, if you're bringing freedom and democracy to a country. Which, by the way, I figured out how to listen to George Bush's speech without going insane. Well, turn off the volume for one thing. But if you're not going to do that, another way to do it that actually makes everything perfectly clear is just do a word substitution. And I came up with this idea back when they did the whole freedom fries thing, when they changed French fries to freedom fries. It's great. All you do is word for word substitution. Every time George Bush says the word freedom, substitute the word fascism. Every time he says the word democracy, substitute the word corporate control. So we're bringing freedom and democracy to Iraq. Damn straight. Oh, I want to say something else too, and we're going to get back to the other, don't worry. And everybody in here, of course, by now certainly knows why my books are written in a nonlinear fashion. Anyway, this whole we thing, you know, we're bringing freedom and democracy to Iraq, is just so weird, because one of the things I think we really need to do is break that identification with the system and with those in power. That's like this friend of mine called me up not very long ago, and she said, how much longer do you think we're going to be in Iraq? And I said, we're in Iraq? Oh my God, I thought we were in Northern California. And she's like, okay. How much longer do you think our troops are going to be in Iraq? I said, I got troops? Holy shit, will they do what I tell them? If I tell them to take out the Grand Coulee, will they do it? And he's like, Derek, this is why I only call you once every 6 weeks. Anyway, so you know, I don't care what your motivation is, you cannot make a moral case for blowing up a children's hospital. That's just an atrocity. I have to admit that line has never before gotten a joke or a laugh. I'm sorry?
You have to go to Nicaragua. You have to go to Nicaragua.
Okay.
Because they destroyed some hospitals.
Right. Well, but see, you can't make a moral case. Well, except if you're bringing freedom. And the point, insofar as there is one, is that we can make up any hypothetical case we want to keep us from ever doing anything. And